Hi, this is Ruben Cohen,
And Gavin Lurson.
and you're watching Ildefonso Presents Lip Roll.
All right, so welcome to Lip Roll and
yeah.
Ildefonso Presents. We have Ruben and Gavin from Lurson Mastering. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So Lurson Mastering, and they are incredible talents. We're going to read off their credits real quick because it's insane. So let's check this out. So Bad Religion, John Lennon, Queens of the Stone Age, Toto, Metallica, Foo Fighters, Elton John, Miranda Lambert, Jeff Bridges, Eric Clapton, The Who, Bruno Mars, Snoop Dogg, Lenny Kravitz, as well as Ella London, who is a co-host on this show.
And she was so excited because I guess you guys mastered her single like
all
a
yellow.
Are You?
She's wearing
Yeah.
all yellow. She has a picture.
She has a
in case
video.
you
That's funny.
forgot.
So she was excited that you guys were here too.
Wow.
And then soundtracks: Marvel's Captain Marvel, Wreck-It Ralph, Black Panther, Thor, Pitch Perfect, Game of Thrones, Split. Endless amounts of projects. Crazy Heart, which Valerie worked on as a vocal coach with Jeff Bridges.
Sure.
Yeah.
So there's a cool connection there, and you guys have multiple Grammys. So welcome, you guys.
Yes.
Thank you.
Obviously,
Well, that's quite an
everybody's
introduction.
excited.
Yeah, that's quite an introduction. I don't know how we're gonna,
It's not
we
even
have to
all
live
your
up
guys.
to.
I always check on your guys' website. I'm like, this is insane. Like, absolutely insane. So, Gavin, you started as a mastering engineer in like 1991. Like, how did you transition into that, or where were you coming from? How did you find it?
I was a student at Berklee College of Music in Boston, and I borrowed my mom's car. When I say borrow, she never really got it back. So I put on. When I say that, she lived in Washington D.C. with my dad. So I packed a futon mattress, all my cassette tapes, Martin D28 acoustic guitar, which I still have, my clothes, and I drove across country from Washington D.C. to L.A. And very quickly, within a few weeks, I had heard through the grapevine. I only knew one or two people here. This was before cell phones, internet, email, anything like that. I look back on that and I wonder actually how we got through it, considering how we do it today. But I arrived in LA, hooked up with a couple of people I knew, through the Berklee College network. And somebody had tried out for this job working for Doug Sachs, who's one of the original engineers, who set this up in the 60s with Bernie Grundman and Bob Ludwig and those guys. There was a job opening and they didn't get the job, and they were kind-hearted enough to let me know about it. So my only criteria, because I was a film scoring major at Berklee, it was to get a job in the music business. That was it. As long as it was the music business, I was game, So I went there, and Doug looked at my resume and didn't even read beyond the name, took me out to coffee, put it in his car, and it somehow got underneath his brake pedal, and it was a stick shift in his clutch, and it started tearing, and I'm thinking, what have I got myself into here, But what he wanted to do was just see who I was as a human, and what I've discovered later, many years later, is that when somebody sees that you go through a place like Berklee, that's enough for them. They know you're serious, you're graduated, that's enough. And when you're entry level, they want to see if you're trainable, really. So that's where he was coming from at the time. I got a job as a runner, which meant picking up sandwiches, sweeping, and making boxes for vinyl. When you ship vinyl, it's a very delicate thing. So you have to have a box with a spindle in it and special spacers and all that. So there was so much vinyl being cut at that time that I had to make the boxes in the morning for all the vinyl getting shipped out. So that started in 91, and very quickly went into engineering from there because we had some turnover at the studio. Trained by Doug, and from there, here I am today.
And how did you guys get connected into what eventually became Lurson Mastering?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at these facilities, they always have people's names in it. And when I did leave Doug's place, you have to do that so people can find you on Google. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to put a name that we could build into a brand, which we've actually done with that. Because at this point, you may as well put Cohen on the logo. It's just that we've established it.
Yeah.
Because Ruben's out there on fire.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the downsides of it. But how did I meet Ruben? His dad had a friend who lived across the street from me, who his dad is a TV writer, and this guy was a TV director and also a writer. So they had a partnership in writing, and he came up to me and he said, you know, I got this partner with a kid. He wants to, you know, just check out the music scene. Are you game? So I said, yeah, send him in. You know, it's cool. So we just gave him some light things to do. He came in. This was about 13 years ago.
Something like that, yeah.
He was 18 years old and just come out of MI, Musicians Institute. He was very young and, you know, almost too young to really get into the job. And I think I was, how old was I at the time? 30 or
I think
something?
you just turned 40.
40?
Well, you
well,
probably
well-
were 39 when we first met.
I'm going to go with 30. So,
Wait, nobody's doing any math here.
I was older than him, and you know, very very quickly I could tell he was serious about it. You know, he had a band at the time, and there was you know, is it going to go this way or this way? But here he is today, and
Yeah.
I knew it, and he knew it, and when you know how it is when you both know something, you just kind of go for it. So at this point, you know, it's more of a partnership. You know what we're doing over there, and he's picked up some amazing things. All that Metallica stuff you talk about, that's all Ruben.
That's amazing. How
Yeah.
would you guys describe like your styles and like the way that you collaborate when you collaborate? Like, how do you guys break down the line between like, because you guys work so well together and the brand is like showcases both of you so well. Like, what's that partnership look like day to day?
Sure.
Well, yeah. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that, but I'll just say this quickly because you know, I developed a style. I came from Doug Sachs. He was my mentor. I was his protege. Great mentor to have. He was one of the originals in the business. And through that, what I learned is, you know, be yourself, have your style of work, which includes not only, you know, the sonic landscape, but how you service people, how you interact, how you integrate with the community of other colleagues, how you integrate with clients, how you service clients, all of that stuff. So I developed that for myself, with, you know, under the tutelage of Doug and with the teaching of that type of mentoring. And I brought my own, you know, it was kind of like new school and old school, and I combined my own thing into it. So Ruben came in and absorbed the same thing and then found his own voice. And that's how it works. So, you know, we both have the we both have the sensibility to work in any genre. You know, it's both our belief that a good engineer should be able to work in any genre and understand it and understand the market. If you're going to take the gig and take somebody's money, you should know exactly and precisely what you're doing. So we learn all the genres. We stay up on it. It's our job to do that. So stylistically, we probably gravitate more to rock and roll, rock records, soundtracks, a lot of soundtracks, orchestral stuff, anything that blooms and has good dynamic range, good depth of field. You know, some of the rock bands you mentioned there, like Queens of the Stone Age, and, you know, there was a Foo Fighters record we did that, you know, that was produced by Butch Vig, who's, you know, who understands sound and size and all that stuff. So we get into that, you know. He's got his own voice out of that. You should talk about that, but I don't know if that ties
that
into what you were
does.
saying.
Yeah.
But
No, exactly.
I think a lot of people find us and search us out because we work strictly analog primarily. Although we do work digitally sometimes, and we actually develop digital tools, which are greatly influenced and modeled after our analog processing. But our sensibilities and the way we approach records, it's really steeped in all this analog goodness, you know, and sometimes we like to really dig into compression and get movement and kind of feel into how compressors move to get size and bring a little life sometimes to recordings when needed. And sometimes you don't want to do that at all. Sometimes you want to take the opposite approach. And I think a good mastering engineer, kind of as Gavin was saying, is someone who can wear many hats and be able to kind of dip into different pools when need be. You know, for instance, if we're working on a metal record, we might take a very, very different approach than we would on maybe more of a prog rock record, you know, Queens of the Stone Age versus like Slipknot or something like that. You know, they're very different sounds, although they could be played one after the other, you know, and kind of on a playlist on Spotify, maybe, perhaps, you know. So a good mastering engineer, you know, the longer I do this, and I'm sure Gavin would agree, the music does most of the talking. You know, our job every day is to size up whatever mix we're working on or batch of mixes we're working on and figure out what we can bring to the table and how we can connect that point A to point B. And that's really what we do, is we use our sensibilities, we're really using our senses and our feelings to try to capture the emotional content of the recording and then realize it in the most effortless way possible. And generally that's the best way. But my own, when I started at the Mastering Lab too. That's where I met Gavin. And, there were some big speakers there. Day one, I was kind of just knocked off my feet because I just realized only at that point, I was a teenager still, just how impactful being immersed in audio can really be, in listening in a treated room and in that type of environment. And I pretty much fell in love right off the bat. And then, working day in and day out, you begin to kind of realize that there's many ways to kind of skin a cat, in this world. And I was working alongside Gavin early on a lot of records off analog tape and absorbing what true analog recordings sound like, real, nothing digital, just real textural, kind of steeped in analog goodness, But at the same time, I had some buddies who became very successful working in hip hop. So I was kind of introduced to these two worlds at the same time in audio processing. There's one producer named Ari Levine who I did a lot of work with, and he was very, very successful, very young, responsible for a lot of those Bruno Mars recordings. And
that's right, yeah.
The Schmusingtons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So before he even met Bruno, we were doing a lot of hip hop, and his clientele was, the guys, they don't do this anymore because of Spotify, but if you walk down Hollywood Boulevard, 15 years ago or so, you couldn't get 3 steps without somebody trying to sell you a CD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was really his clientele, all those guys. He was making beats and records for those guys. So they all needed mastering, and that stuff would come through the studio, and I really cut my teeth in learning how to process hip hop and learning a lot from Ari, and then at the same time learning how to process, coming off analog tape, how to properly play back a tape, which is a science in and of itself, properly how to do that. Sometimes learning how little to do and how far you can get by doing very, very little, which is something that is invaluable in the world of mastering. And I think a lot of times people miss because, sometimes I feel like people that are trying to attempt the craft feel like they have to be impressive, and they end up getting in their own way. They do way too much, and they end up using their ears rather than their heart, if that makes any sense. They try to be heard rather than felt. So I think as soon as you're coming from that place, a lot of times you can miss the mark.
Yeah. So to do what we do, he was talking about getting from point A to point B. So there's always a visualization. When I was saying earlier about, being an engineer that understands a genre, point B in space is the place you want to take something. So when somebody comes in with some music, we have to assess what it is, where it is, the sonic landscape, their wishes, their desires, just size everything up. That has everything to do with the music and the people we're dealing with together. It's not just the music. Our thoughts are to service them, but also to service their fans. Yeah. Because if we service their fans, they're going to be successful. Yeah. If we service them, sometimes they'll be less successful there. So and we make that known. So it's all in the equation, all communicated. But that point B in space is the place you want to take it to. So once you figure out what it is you're dealing with, that's point A. And every day is different. Point A is here, point A is here, point A is here, point A is here. Point B is always this same area. If you listen to all those records you mentioned, there's a kind of a sonic space that they all live in. You know? And so we plot the journey, the shortest journey, I'm going to say easiest, but it's not so that we can have an easy day. Yeah. It's so that it doesn't sound like we were there. Yeah. So it's plotting the best journey to get from point A to point B, probably using as little gear as possible. And that's I think when the best skills come in. If we use compression, it's for the musicality of the use of compression. It's not necessarily to make things loud. If it is to make things loud, that's because that genre calls for that. Yeah, totally. If you get something with too much dynamic range and it has to fit in this world where things are just crushed because that's what's going on in that marketplace, then you got to go there. But it's for a musical purpose. So we're plotting that journey from point A to point B, and the ultimate goal is to make it sound like we were never there. We shouldn't exist. Yeah. Those fans need to connect with that recording so that they can then be connected to that artist. Yeah. And if it sounds like somebody forced that
Yeah.
happen, we have not done a good job.
Totally.
So we have to be invisible, and the key behind it is making stuff sound as big as possible.
Totally. I feel like there's two kind of thoughts that bounce off of that. One is kind of where mastering's going. You know, I think like the average producer is starting, just starting out, is even hearing the words because of what they're getting marketed towards, what, these online mastering services, all that. But then there's also the equation of like how you guys balance, established mixers or established producers who have their own thoughts on how their records should be mastered. Like, how do you balance both this like new generation of, people who, I know you fought the loudness wars kind of earlier, but is there a new force at play for you guys with the online mastering? It's easy now, but you guys also were a part of building an app. So I kind of want to hear your guys' thoughts on the future and like maybe some of the challenges that come with your clients, your mixing engineers.
Well, it's, trends change, times change, but at the end of the day, the human being is not evolving quick enough to change the scope of human hearing, the ability to hear from the lowest to the highest frequency. And there's a pleasing element of that, and there's a displeasing element of that. And the more technology that comes into your life, the more digital technology comes into your life, the easier it is to be displeasing with how you can process sound. And there's a reason for that. And one of the reasons is that the gear is now the mentor. There's no mentor-protege relationships anymore. I mean, few and far between. It used to be that was the system, that was the machinery. Now, the manufacturers are getting you a bunch of gear for next to nothing. And you sit there and you go, okay, well, I must use this stuff because, somebody paid me a few bucks and I got to show that I did something, and people end up overdoing it and they don't come to it with a level of experience. So this, in a way, can dictate what's happening. If you get enough people, let's say the people like me who came up through a mentor and Ruben are few and far between next to everybody who's got all the plugins and Pro Tools or whatever they have, so there's a large number of people making music, doing stuff. I totally support it. Because it allows artists who have no resources to actually express themselves. Whereas when I came up, it was very, very difficult. You saw all the time everybody's trying to get a record deal 20 years ago, and it was difficult to get into the system. Now, self-publishing is free and instant. So it's a great thing for that type of expression, but along with it comes, this kind of like, throw it to the wall stuff, and people tend to overdo things when you do that. If you give somebody a Formula One car, they're probably going to figure out, like how they can do too much with it. But the key is to understand the power and use it only when you need it, which could be never. So you can sit there with this hugely powerful thing that when to use, when to touch, and when to turn it on, and it's just always there, but you might not always need it. You may never need it. So that's kind of the metaphor for how I look at that stuff. And how that's working is you're getting a lot of music out there that is compressed and pushed, and that is a sound, that is a thing that fans have come to expect. There's a feel, They don't really understand what we do, but they feel the output of all this music coming at them. It's the same in film, and what we're experiencing in music. People are self-filming now, YouTube stars, all this stuff. So it defines styles, and these styles change. And how we relate to that with what we do is, we've put a flag in the ground. This is who we are. This is what we do. Yeah, you play with the loudness war, but the fact is that anybody can. It's not that we or anybody else has some special tools to go there. Everybody's got these tools. Everybody can be the loudest person. So our doctrine is to create size and let that music bloom, like Ruben was saying. Let it bloom, let it grow into something. Put your heart. We look at it, put our heart into it, bring it out the most we can to fit the artist's visualization, and we look at depth of field, we look at size, we look at competing with all that other stuff that's going on, and just somehow coming up with an aggregate to fit in there. But it's always got to be pleasing to the ear. Some music is very difficult to listen to because it's edgy and brittle. So we pay attention to all the analog and digital technology on how to, have that depth of field and size, and that you want to listen to it over and over. It sounds sort of analog. And we built a plugin, as you pointed out, right around that concept. So there's presets in there. There's EDM presets and hip hop and Americana and film score, orchestral. Doesn't mean you have to use those presets with those genres. You can play around, but the sensibilities were built into that. It's available through IK Multimedia, we're proud of it. It's good. And the reason we built it, and then I'll say that, and then I'll shut up, and maybe Ruben's got something to say about this, because I'm going on here. But the reason we built it is because we see a lot of people who don't have the rates to come and work with us, and the only reason that we have the rates is so that we can actually be there. If we're doing everything for free, we don't get to pay the rent, and therefore we don't get to be there. So we have to have a kind of a minimal charge just to keep alive, as everybody does, keep the lights on, as they say. But there's a lot of people that don't have that ability, don't have those resources, and then there's other people who do, but sometimes just need a fix because they're sending off something and they want to get a gig in a film or something, and they'll have a better shot when they use something like that. So we looked at it as extending our service, essentially. We don't make any money from the software. Nobody does. It's that kind of world. It's like doing music. Nobody makes money off it. But it extends the service of the brand. It lets people know who we are. They get a little taste of what we do. If it helps them, that's great, and then they know who we are. So it's a cool thing. We're proud of it. But I don't know if you have anything to say about all that.
It's also a tool that, just talking about the plugin, it's kind of saving people from themselves that don't quite understand the process, because there are other tools that do a whole lot of things, and you can go this way and that way, but this tool sort of keeps you on the rails. It makes sure that you don't roll a gutter ball, it keeps you on target just by default, and it kind of guides the user. So in fact, we eliminated a lot of the knobs you can press and twist, because even somebody that's experienced could get lost very quickly and somehow get down a road that they wish they maybe didn't, and then only realize that the next day. So it kind of keeps you tethered to where you want to end up to a large degree, especially if you don't quite know what you're doing. It's a big question. When something lands on our desk every day, somebody says, well, how do you know what to do? Do you want to listen to something different? Do you want to listen to another, recording that might sound sort of in the same vein? And that can be helpful, but a lot of times that can actually hurt the process. That can actually take you outside of where the recording kind of wants to live. And that's more how we operate. We kind of, you develop a certain sense of where something wants to gravitate towards, and it has everything to do with where the mix is left. So it's somewhat genre dependent, but the mix does most of the talking for you. We have all types of conversations with producers, and the ones that really understand the process, those are the most valuable. But some people, they don't even know what to say. They end up talking about where they recorded it or how they recorded or what mics they used, and that's important to some degree. But if you play the song, that tells us exactly where it is in sonic space, and then immediately in our mind's eye we project where we imagine it. But then it goes even further, because then you have to do it. And then along the way of doing so, you kind of test the waters, you feel the temperature of it, and then that allows you to fine tune it from there. So we kind of almost need to just get our hands on it to really feel what the potential of this thing can be, to really, really take it to that last maybe 5%. I'd say, 95% of the way there is done within the first few minutes generally. And if it's not working at that point, we decide to take another road, and then we fine tune from that place. I think you were also asking about how things change maybe with the new platforms, Spotify.
There's like I've heard like mixing engineers, the one that we know, where he said that like there's a way to manipulate the algorithm to where there's a sense that the way the playlisting works and the way that Spotify chooses how they play, it's like mastering. I've heard both sides. I've heard that mastering really, really matters now, because you don't want to be too loud, because the algorithm actually dislikes that.
And then I've gone the other way.
I've also heard that mixed engineers are like, but now is also a really good time, because it's actually easier to get stuff to sound where it needs to sound for Spotify. Where do you guys kind of land on that? Because I'm kind of fuzzy on exactly how it all actually plays out.
Well, now the loudness wars. Thankfully, the streaming platforms put the final nail in the coffin, because now it doesn't matter more than ever
And
It
how
never-
so? Like, what's the change?
Well, generally, the louder everything's being leveled down to a common denominator where everything can sort of exists.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a different way it's leveled down for a playlist versus an album.
Mm-hmm.
So, for obvious reasons, you wouldn't want your album to, like, hypothetically, if you have one track that's an interlude, that's way lower, that should be way lower.
Yeah.
You don't want it to be bumped right up in your, and you lose the natural flow intended by the producer and the mixer and the artist, really everybody involved, including us. You don't want that to be lost. That's part of the musicality, and that could, if not done properly, the AI, which does this, could offset that, and it loses whatever the intent was. That being said, you're in a different scenario with a playlist, and maybe an orchestral piece needs to live next to an EDM track, and these are on opposite sides of the sonic spectrum, maybe, in terms of how they're processed, the dynamic nature, how loud they are. So if you're strictly talking about level, well, if mastering was only to get level, then yeah, there's no need for it anymore at all. But that's not what mastering is, at least not to us. It's a musical process, and it's really bringing the life and the textures out when need be, and sometimes it's very little. Sometimes there's just have to breathe on something, and sometimes you have to do a lot, In terms of operating our console, maybe like Gavin was saying, sometimes you have to be as heavy as a tank or as light as a feather. And a good mastering engineer will understand how far to push something and how far not to push something. But to cap it all, in terms of what Spotify does, is it does lower everything down. So generally, if you push something louder, you're going to end up with something smaller and quieter.
Wow.
So you have to, our philosophy is we're not trying to get level for level's sake anymore. Although if we can achieve some level along the way, sure. But it's not for the sake of achieving level. It's for achieving impact and size and musicality. And sometimes in order to do that, you actually have to get some level to get the compressors working, depending on how your gain structure is all set up. And I don't want to get too technical, depending on the listeners here. But that's all part of how we determine where we go.
Yeah.
Well, can I say this? So back in the day of radio, it's still the day of radio, but when there was only one format that altered levels, and it was radio. And they would use traditionally a de-esser and some leveling to put the music all in the same kind of rough area.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at people making music, at the end of the day, there's a thing called the peak to average ratio. And what that is it's the amount of distance in decibels, measured in decibels, dB, between your average level, the middle ground of your music, your average level, and the highest peak. And that distance measured in decibels is your peak to average ratio, the peak being the peak of the music and the average being the average level. So when you talk about dynamic range of a music, if you're dealing with a movie score or something, you loud and quiet pieces, you have to really be careful about too much dynamic range and too little dynamic range. If you have too little, the quiet stuff sounds loud, and then when the loud bit hits, there's no crescendo, there's no emotion to that music. So you have to have that dynamic range, but you also have to listen to it in a car on the freeway. So, I hate to say it, but you also have to not have too much dynamic range. The purists in music, if you go to a live performance, that's the purest form that you can hear music. You hear the actual dynamic range that is performed. So what we're dealing with is, and it's not that old, it's only several decades old, the art of capturing and recording music, a live performance, so that it can be enjoyed at a later time. So that's our job. We're dealing with that. We're dealing with that capture. And because it's so easy and prevalent, and in an operating system of a computer these days, and anybody can record and capture music, I don't really think about the history of it and what it all means. So when you break it down to what it all means, and you start to look at the dynamic range and the way music is performed, the way it's intended by the artist, and you pay attention to these things, and then you combine with that the way music gets consumed on a recording, you want to find ways to figure out how the consumer can digest it as close to the way the performer intended it. So if that means you have to reduce the dynamic range, there's ways to cheat that a little bit. If you do have to reduce the dynamic range so that you're driving on the freeway and you can listen to the quiet bits, you maybe open up the loud parts with EQ. So you are reducing the dynamic range, but letting it bloom still so that it can still have a feel as though it was intended by the performer.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the expectations bestowed on us, you know.
Yeah.
So with that said, when you look at the technology of all the streaming services now, they are the new FM radio. They're the new ways that that music gets consumed. And if you just go back a couple of years to CDs, we're talking about CDs like they're over, which they kind of are in a way.
Yeah.
And you know, iTunes even. Once we shipped it, nothing was done, and that's why everybody wanted it loud. You know, nobody wanted to be quieter than everybody else. It was always an artist insecurity thing. Everybody knows that.
Yeah.
I don't want to sell artists out. You know, I work with artists, but you know, if you have an amazing song and it's a little quieter than some crappy song, people are going to listen to the amazing song. It's got nothing to do with how loud it is, and everybody's kind of figured that out by now. We put our foot in the ground with that early on, and that's part of who we are and how we're known. Anyhow, getting back to the you know, the Spotify and the other streaming services now. I don't want to pin it just on Spotify. It's all the streaming services. It's a whole, you know. So what they look at, if they get something that's crushed, if you compress it for the sake of level, what you're doing is you're reducing the dynamic range. You are reducing that peak to average ratio, making it smaller, making the distance smaller between the average of the music to the highest peak. So if you just hold on to that for a moment, and then you look at some other music, some orchestral stuff where the peak to average ratio is higher, what these streaming services will take the average level. They've turned everything down so that they can allow for these high peaks without distortion. If you keep it loud, those high peaks will distort. So they've pulled everything down. Because if you present yourself, hey, we're Spotify, we're Pandora, whoever we are, and here's all this music, there's not a single soul that will say, oh, what's the average level that you pipe that to me? Nobody's interested because it's one level and there's nothing to compare it to. There's no relative. So they can actually set it wherever they want, and it's completely meaningless to the listener because they'll just take that as to what that average level is. So every streaming service is different, and they've all got slightly different reasons for picking different levels. But when you go from Pandora over to Spotify or Apple, you're not going to take with you, oh, well, this is they refer to it as the LUFS level. This is theirs, and this is theirs, and I don't like that. You know, nobody goes there. So it's a non-issue. So if you can, so what I'm leading to is to say, if you get some crushed thing because you think you have to make it loud and push it up into the corner, and it goes off to the streaming services, the size of that, the peak to average ratio, the size of the music is going to remain because that's what we printed. You cannot undo it. The only way you can undo it is call us up, have us redo the work differently, and that's the only way you can undo that. So so that music, if it's pushed loud, will actually sound smaller next to something that's printed quiet. So what's going on in streaming, and people are starting to understand this. Our colleagues understand this, and you understand it as we're talking. But you know, average consumers of music that don't have the technical expertise in processing music are starting to feel this. You know, it reveals itself. You know, it reveals itself in an informative way. And you know, when you say this is important, this is not important, it's all important because it's all felt. And when you got people that do what we do, and you pay attention to these things, you're actually creating a standard that's sending people to, you know, a finely cooked steak instead of, you know, a quick cheeseburger. You know, if you grow up on that, that's all you'll know. But if you know what the good stuff is, then that's what you'll know. So that's really what we're trying to do. Is we're trying to maintain these standards and keep that up there. So I sort of covered a lot of topics, but hope they all kind of make sense.
Super interesting. I think one other thing we wanted to talk about was just like with like the work that you guys done with like Marvel, Game of Thrones, those
franchises,
those like big franchises. Like how much of the process is that exactly what you're talking about? It's just kind of like it's any other project you're listening to the music you don't need to know, and how much of it is like you need to have context because it means this much to culture, this much to. Does it change at all when you receive a big project like that?
And I actually have a follow-up question because I know you said earlier, and both of you said, like, because you studied, when you're studying a certain genre or whatever, you're going to listen to it, you're going to know what those kind of things are. Does that also play into, like a big cinematic universe like Marvel or Game of Thrones, where it's like a cultural impact? You guys look into kind of like what that is, and does that affect your process, or you just see it for?
I do have thoughts, but I've been hogging the floor, so why don't you go?
Well, we're in a privileged position to service these projects, but also kind of, in some ways, set standards too.
Yeah.
You know, and so that takes, there's a lot of responsibility with that.
Totally.
But there's never a situation where we're giving any more attention to one project versus another. Sometimes there's a little more, many mixed revisions back and forth because somebody decides to play, different guitar lead on something or a different, just choice. And there's budgets for that versus another project. So we end up working on it just by default for that reason. But there's no special attention we give any other project. The process is the process for us. And we connect with the music and we do our thing, and that's really it. But how do we size up where to go on a Game of Thrones or a Marvel movie? It's really the same as what we're talking about. We're sizing up the material and we're figuring out where the average or the peak to average ratio is in terms of dynamic range, just in terms of dynamic processing, not even talking about colorization in terms of, hey, do we want to use this type of EQ against this type of EQ? Maybe we'll get into something that's a little more colored or a little more transparent, depending on what's being fed to us. Yeah. So we'll wear a certain hat for whatever occasion it is, really. But when it comes to orchestral music, generally speaking, especially when you're dealing with these guys that, like Ramin Djawadi doing Game of Thrones or Westworld, there's a lot of dynamic range. It's all part of the nature of the music. So we have to treat that, accordingly, in terms of, now getting back to Spotify for a second, or digital audio in general, just to be a little technical for a second, digital audio is the same for everybody. We have a ceiling. It's called digital zero, right? And if you go over that ceiling, you're going to get in distortion. That's the same for everybody. Every mastering house has to deal with this. Every producer in their bedroom or in their home, in their project studio, it's the same for everybody. We're all dealing with the same confine. The confines of, if you go over that threshold, you're going to get into distortion. So what we do, generally speaking, is we put a brick wall limiter right before zero. Depending on how much we want to use that limiter, or maybe not at all, we want to make sure nothing distorts, because nobody likes that type of distortion, unless it's for some particular creative purpose. We're dealing with how these transients are integrating, or I suppose dancing around that zero mark, right? Yeah. And so if you think about it, that's the ceiling, and how the music is relating to that ceiling, then you can kind of work backwards from that place. Instead of pushing something up into that, or trying to get loud up against that, you kind of almost visualize it in your mind's eye there. That's the limit, and then you can let everything be as open and dynamic, or you can kind of start juicing it up and kind of squeezing it up against that digital zero. So if you think about it that way, that's how we should be thinking about level. And then from that point, if it's brought down by the platforms, that exists already. That stays that way, no matter if you lower it 3 dB, if you lower it 2 dB, the musicality remains the same. And the good news is, I think you asked a question earlier, do we do anything different now that Spotify or iTunes or even YouTube is lowering things? And the answer is no, because we're going off the musicality, right? So we're making our best choices for the music that's wherever we're working on at hand. And if they populate, if they're lowered differently on one platform versus the other, the sound remains the same. So we're going for sound, and that's where it really ends. And level is part of that sound. I worked on a record. I like to talk about this record a lot. It's a record called "Here" by Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros. Maybe you're familiar with it. And it's one of the quieter records that we've put out. And I'm sure Gavin could talk about some of the quieter records. I think "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" is a record that he sometimes brings up.
I remember this Edward Sharpe record, though, because I left the studio one night and I came back the next morning and Ruben was still there.
Yeah, well...
and I think that was 4 days in a row,
Yeah,
right?
Well, we were up against a deadline for Starbucks because they were going to put it in the Starbucks shop. And we just had to make this deadline. And the sun wasn't going to come up the next day. So
Because you know the sun won't rise if.
somehow
Hopefully
I
they were
could
giving you Starbucks to keep you up all night. You know?
Yeah.
Make sure you're like,
They didn't.
Hey, we should have been endorsed by Starbucks.
that's
then.
right.
Yeah, there was no Starbucks showing up for us.
No, they owe us.
Yeah. But the sonic character of that album is specifically the way it is due to the fact that it's not overly processed in terms of getting a certain amount of hype in terms of level. In fact, the only compressor in that signal path is a Fairchild 670. It's a vintage kind of, some people refer to it as the holy grail of compressors, and it has a very distinguishable texture to it.
Yeah.
And that album is kind of steeped in Fairchild. You know, you put it on, it's like, yeah, that, and you connect with it in a very particular way, but that album was mixed and produced to have a very, very wide dynamic range. So it's part of the sound, and if we went for a more level, we could have.
Yeah.
And it would have still been great, but it wouldn't have that same textural feel, you know? Sometimes when you're working on a project and you don't push it, for good reason, it almost, you know, you can almost hold it in your hand and you can like, you know, it feels a certain way, you know, and you can lose that very quickly and not even know it if you don't know what you're doing by pushing it even, you know, half dB further. All of a sudden it can certainly feel good, but it's lost that textural feel. So that's a big part of how we go about the process.
I got a jump off question real quick for Gavin off that, because that's a cool, interesting project that like you had something that you were trying to, a vision that you were, you know, trying to come across. Is there like a project that you've worked on that maybe has like a similar story, that like something that you're super proud of something you did that like it resonated a certain way either with you or with, you know, audiences or?
As Ruben mentioned, the Oh Brother Where Art Thou soundtrack is a special one.
And I love that soundtrack. So I do love
Everybody loved that soundtrack. And so I got a call from T-Bone Burnett as the Coen brothers were making that movie, and he said, hey, you know, we just want to put the soundtrack together and try to get some press. We haven't found a home for it, and we're hoping it's going to do okay, you know. The music spanned 80 years. It was an 80-year span of music.
Wow.
There's some pretty old recordings on there, new recordings, different arrangements. I mean, it really, really, you know, scoped the whole gamut, you know. And Mike Piersante, who is the engineer of that, I actually just got off the phone with him on the way here on an unrelated issue. This was like, I mean, I think at this point it's probably 20 years ago. Maybe
2001, I think, is when it came out, right?
Yeah, so 18 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
I was a huge Coen Brothers fan. So.
Well, so T-Bone, you know, I'd worked with T-Bone a few times before that, and incidentally, we've done every record for T-Bone since then. So he's been a very long time client, and you know, that's something of note because you develop this unspoken language about where to go with music, and a lot of the stuff we're talking about is in those relationships. You know, it's just built in there. So the key behind that record was doing as little as possible and making, you know, there's so much diversity, but you want to put it on and you just want to hear it all the way through without adjusting and leveling and all this crazy stuff you got to do. And the approach was conservative in that regard, but still we had to EQ it. We had to get a pause dirty on it, but you know, the really depth of field, analog. I mean, it had to sound analog. It came in an analog tape. I think if I recall, it was 30 IPS quarter-inch reel-to-reel tape. So I had to get that over to digital, you know, with our flavor and our sound on it, and it came out, and then all of a sudden people saw that movie and saw George Clooney in that microphone, and it made everybody buy the soundtrack. And I think to date it's about 18 or 20 million sold.
Wow!
And people for some time lined up at the door saying, how do you make it sound like that? And it's like, okay, well, you don't do this and you don't do this and you unplug that and you take this off and you really, you know, I had a conversation with Jeff Emmerich once, the Beatles engineer. He recently died, but he was a great member of the community, very open. Everybody knew him. Everybody loved him.
I was in a class that he spoke at once.
Yeah, he was just this accessible guy, you know. Yeah. And so, you know, if I tell my friends not in the music business that I had a conversation with Jeff Emmerich, they're like, oh my God, how did you do that? But in fact, he was just this beautiful guy who was available to anybody who wanted to have a conversation with him about anything. And he said to me that every time he goes to like an AES convention or something, people come up and show him all this stuff, all this gear. And I can quote him. he said, I don't know what all this shit is. We just had a cable and we plugged it in. And he's talking about the Beatles, you know. So what they made with so little is pretty remarkable. So that was kind of the point, the long-winded point of that.
Yeah.
But, you know, less is more on something like that. And that record really connected with people because it reintroduced them to a genre of music that was well there, but just not as alive as it was until that soundtrack came along. And T-Bone has this remarkable ability to connect fans with the right music at the right time, with the right artists, with the right session musicians, and the right studios. Somehow, I don't know how he does it, but he's got this. He's like Yoda, you know. He just, you know, walks in and waves his hand, and all the elements kind of come together. He's a remarkable human being that way. He's a total genius, and he pulled that one off, and it did wonders for our business and our career. And you know, people kind of came to know us for that. But then we would work on a Green Day record or a Foo Fighters record,
which is cool about your business and the way you guys structure.
Yeah, we can do the rock and roll. We can do the loud. You know, we can get into all that stuff. We love it. We do that mostly, actually. Yeah. But you know, then we're known for this orchestral stuff, this Game of Thrones, this beautiful, huge dynamic range. Ramin Djawadi stuff, another genius. You know, this organic analog Americana stuff, this heavy rock stuff. Yeah. You know, Metallica, Ruben's doing well in that. So I don't know. I've sort of lost track of the question.
Well, that was like a special process.
I hope we kind of covered some of the meat and potatoes of our daily life there.
I have another one kind of off of that is like, I remember a story you were telling me about the Foo Fighters record with Dave Grohl and Cymbals. Like, how often do you get that where you have an artist is the client and knows their record? And like, because when I would come to you, I'm back and forth, like, do I know this record now? I've spent so much time on it. Like, am I the one who should be speaking?
He has an amazing set of ears. So he's a drummer, obviously, everybody knows, but he's the front man of the band. Yeah. So when you take this music from A to B, as we were talking about, you know, it comes with compromises. You have to do the stuff that we do to bring it to that final place. Because he's a drummer, he was listening to a very specific frequency in the cymbal. We're listening to the whole of the music. How does it present? How is the artist presented? Where's the mid-range? Where's the music living? I'm listening to the vocal. How does the support of this band match this vocal? I'm thinking of Dave Grohl. Dave Grohl's thinking of Taylor's cymbals. Obviously, he's thinking of that stuff too. But he was getting concerned, just making sure that was ringing out the way that they had mixed it. There's a guy named James Brown who mixed it. Yeah,
he's done some Kings of Leon stuff too. I think
a different James Brown than we know. But Butch Vig produced that, and so he was just very concerned as we were working to make sure that stuff really rung out in the way that they had intended it to. Most people will lose sight of that. Yeah. Sometimes you get people in the A&R departments who talk about the snare. You know, it's kind of a running joke in the music industry. You know, I don't want to talk to you about your snare. And everybody kind of understands this compromises. So we had to, you know, just get on a level with him. It's our job. We have to service. We have to get into people's head. So we would have him in the room a lot just to make sure he was hearing what he wanted to hear. Because if we're listening to other things, and we work on that, then maybe we'll lose a little bit of this thing he wants to hear. But if we go back to the thing he wants to hear, maybe we'll lose the thing we're working on. So it's just a balancing act.
It's incredible to me because I've heard from a famous rock photographers talking about, he showed up to a Foo Fighters rehearsal and they immediately handed him earplugs. He's like, I've done Led Zeppelin, I've shot everyone, I don't need earplugs. And the roadies were like, no, you're going to need them for the Foo Fighters. And he said he almost vomited after hearing that rehearsal.
They're a great band.
How do you sustain your ears like that? Whether you're Dave Grohl or you guys, like, how do you protect that?
We pay attention to that. We you know, you can go and look at the OSHA standards, OSHA, the OSHA standards of hearing health. So it's a given amount of dB per hours per day that's healthful, and the higher the dB, the less amount of hours. So we pay attention to that. Use measuring devices to check that all out and make sure we're within the healthful standards. And we use ATC monitors. And I've never heard a speaker other than an ATC that will leave you unfatigued. I mean, there's some out there. There's good speakers. I don't want to badmouth them, but
Yeah.
but ATCs for us really, just leave you unfatigued. And the way we feed them, we have a custom analog console that's 0 level. It's not a +4. There's a specific way we feed them as well.
Yeah.
And we turn down the tweeters a little bit on them, much to the dismay of the owners of ATC. But, they ship it the way that you're supposed to use them. But we turn the tweeters down a little bit so that we can hear more of the growl of the music than the high fidelity. And it's we save our ears that way.
Yeah, the thing that fatigues your ears is actually not level so much as it is distortion. And people,
Really? I
yes,
didn't know that.
So if you're
Oh, yeah.
if you're hitting a converter too hard or something like that, and you're listening on very compressed music, that can fatigue your ears quicker than something that's a little bit more natural and not as hyped. Maybe.
Yeah.
So
So as long as it's a natural, good sounding record, I can't get in trouble for blasting it,
well,
is what
there's
you're
that,
telling
and
me.
also, of course, the speakers can be very forgiving
Yeah,
too, because
yeah.
a speaker has a certain amount of distortion in it just inherently.
Yeah.
If you're hyping it so much, so these smooth ATCs that we get to work on
Yeah.
are very forgiving, and especially when you're dealing with real. I mean, a lot of speakers have DSP in them now too, and that can introduce distortion too if they're driven too hard.
Should we explain what that is?
Digital signal processing.
Okay.
So it's actually if you're feeding a speaker with DSP in it, which a lot of these speakers have now. It's getting actually inside the guts of it. It's getting converted from analog to digital, and then from digital to analog again.
So when you listen to music, if you come to me and as you've done and give us music to work on, and we give it back to you,
Yeah.
you've got a file. It's
Yeah.
not music. It's data.
Yeah.
It becomes music only when you hit play on a device, which then triggers a digital to analog converter,
Oh, wow.
which can only work with a set of amplifiers.
Yeah.
So a conversion chip like an analog to digital conversion or digital to analog conversion can only work with amplification. So if I give you your file back, you're done working with us, you're taking it home, we've done our thing, it sounds like a hit. You hit play, it activates the digital to analog converter and the amplifiers, which then go to a speaker or a pair of earplugs or whatever, however you're amplifying the signal. At that point, it's music again. So we have to take that into account. How are the fans going to listen to this stuff? There's a lot of distortion in all of these devices. Now there's a lot of Bluetooth listening and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So when Ruben talks about DSP, a lot of speaker systems, once you've converted the signal back to analog on the way to the speaker, it's ideal to keep it analog. But what happens in these speakers is it goes into the crossover network, gets reconverted to digital, processed, and then reconverted to analog again. And the process of that and the amplification of that can cause distortion, and often does. In the pro speaker division, less so. A lot of pro speakers do have DSP, but that process can be fatiguing into itself.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
so keeping it analog, which ATC does, is there's another company called PMC, which is very close to ATC. They do a great job too. That's the ideal.
Yeah.
And there's so many areas where the signal gets converted back and forth, and that's where you pick up all this inherent distortion, and the distortion will kill you.
Yeah, and there's some recordings that basically you don't want your ear getting pinned. You want your ear to move. Your ear is essentially like its own microphone in a way. It's telling your brain what's going on. So if it's moving more naturally, it's going to be less fatiguing. Where if it's getting pinned, it can get very fatiguing very quickly and actually kind of hurt after a while.
Yeah.
Or your ears start folding down.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so just a couple more questions. This is amazing.
Yeah, this is great.
Have a couple more things I wanted to ask you. One was, okay, how do you guys stay zen? Because to me, you guys, like the process that where you are in the project kind of requires you to have this level head kind of, because people have to let go. They have to trust you guys, and they do trust you guys. How do you guys stay that constant for so many projects, whether it's Marvel, Game of Thrones, how do you guys keep yourselves functioning to do all this work and to do it well and to have a fresh perspective that everyone requires from you? It's kind of like a colorist.
Sleep is a good one. Yeah, if we can get it.
We're both meditators.
Yeah, I'd imagine so.
But that's just who we are as human beings, and it's independent of one another. It's just a coincidence. but we have our things we do outside of work. But the Zen space, I mean, you've often been quite articulate about that.
Yeah.
There's it's music. It's a meditation unto itself. And my particular pleasure is the service we provide. Because how can you? People say, "What's your favorite album you've worked on?" How can you have that? It's not whether you like the music or not. It's so our machinery, our studio manager, Ruben, the other people that work there. How do we collectively come together to create a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts to service the clients, service the fans? And when I see that working in concert, that brings me a great joy. So I'll sometimes get intense about creating that because, when you deal with creative people, as we all are in that facility, everybody jumps off and does things their own way. So you got to corral that energy and keep it in one place. And that can be an intense process and make a person in my position a little unpopular. But but when it works, it's great because you're looking at this creation and that leaves you zen, and I like that. And also just regards to the music, but you talk more eloquently about that than I.
I think as we're balancing the music, we have to make sure we balance ourselves, because when we're working in audio, you can very quickly get in your own head. And generally when you start thinking too much, you're kind of begin off it's like going up on stage and being self-conscious, you're not operating from the right place. You want to be able to connect with the music, and musical energy is just like any other energy, so you have to make sure that you sustain that and cultivate that, and sleep, diet, all the stuff, for anything, you keep yourself, you bring a certain amount of energy to the projects you work on every day, and you have to make sure that you can continue to, because the work's not going to stop, hopefully, and it hasn't yet. So we have to make sure that we can take that on and deliver. So, how do we do it? I don't know. I say this every day that I feel privileged because not yet have I ever once looked at the clock in this job.
Wow.
And it doesn't mean that it's not hard work, but it's more like, do I have enough time to get it done rather than I want the day to be over. So, in terms of being fatigued or having enough energy or making sure that we stay balanced, I think the music kind of charges us. If we do it right, we'll get more energy from the music and we can go home and do it again the next day. So keeping yourself in a certain space. I like to drink green tea too. I find that somehow, instead of coffee, oftentimes kind of puts me in that matcha green tea, puts me in a certain zone, and kind of relaxes my body and lets my ears open up in a particular way too. Kind of stimulates my mind. But there's different ways everybody goes about it.
That's why you gave me shit about taking the matcha home the other day.
I
did not know this about Ruben. I'll get you. I'll bring some more.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think I love that dynamic about you guys, and I could sense that, like, as a client, I could sense that you care about how it's run and that you stay balanced, and that those forces are at play beyond just making cool music.
That's what makes it worth it. If you see that stuff, then it's very satisfying, gratifying. That drives us.
Yeah,
it's wonderful that you see that. That's very meaningful.
Awesome. Yeah, that's amazing. Is there any other questions? I think I have like one last one.
I know one that we kind of talked about, a question that had come up in our research is something that like a lot of people had asked. It's just like, and I know it might seem a little basic, but at least for some of our audience, just like maybe explain exactly what mastering is and like dispel probably maybe a couple rumors that like people might think it is and it's not. And I know we've covered it, a lot and like a lot of the technical stuff, but I think like
the first time user of a mastering engineer, what are they, or what is that myth that everyone thinks when they bring it to you guys?
I'm going to let Ruben take that. He speaks very articulately about it, but I'll say this, it's the art of balance. It's creating a whole, everything in life is, when it's successful, I guess a creative endeavor is when the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And when we deal with the sonic spectrum and the technology that allows the sonic spectrum to match somewhat what the abilities of the human hearing range are, using that knowledge of the human being, of technology, to capture the vision of an artist, to create the whole that's greater than the sum of the parts, to create something that's one thing and not just a bunch of shards, it's the art of balance. And then how that gets digested, once it leaves us, like I was talking about.
Our job in another way is to create connectivity, really. When you play something out of the speakers, are you connected with it or are you not? Does it somehow feel like there's something in between you and the recording? If we can take away whatever's disconnected, if there is some kind of disconnect, and you completely feel connected to it, then we've done our best job. And how do we
Yeah.
do it? It's like anything else. A good way to think about it is sort of like Photoshop to audio in a way.
Yeah.
We're colorizing it, we're bringing textures, we're balancing it, we're creating
Yeah.
balance that might not be there.
Yeah.
You know, we're listening to the individual elements in the mix,
Yeah.
you know, whatever it is. And we're seeing if there is a connectivity there that might not quite be there in the mix, and we can bring that in mastering.
Uh-huh.
Or, you know, we just somehow enhance that just a little bit more.
Yeah.
And sometimes just that little bit more is just that, you know,
Yeah.
it creates that connection. So you put it on and there you have it. You're not thinking about it. It just is
Yeah.
always there. And the good thing about digital audio is that, I mean, not to say that there's any,
Yeah.
but digital audio has come a long way, is that it always will exist that way.
Yeah.
You know, with vinyl, it's got a shelf life. With
Yeah.
analog tape, it's got a shelf life. You
Yeah.
know, these things are tangible and they eventually will deteriorate, you
Yeah.
know, but ones and zeros will stand the test of time.
Yeah.
So if we can capture that and it's backed up on a hard drive or backed up on the cloud, it's going to stay that way forever. So it's kind of really cool.
Yeah. My final question, it always comes back to Led Zeppelin for me. Like, can you tell me just a little bit about Robert Plant, the record that you guys did with T-Bone?
Oh yeah,
Like
Raising
just
Sand. Yeah.
anything that comes to mind about it or that process that is special?
Well, I can say that when I heard it, I knew it was special.
Yeah.
You know, you don't always hear that. You'll work on something, and then you'll be in the Beverly Center or something, and you'll go, "Wow, that sounds like a hit. That is a hit. Hey, wait, we worked on that."
yeah.
You know, and you're working
Yeah.
on it. You're in work mode.
Yeah.
You know, so you work on so much music that you don't always sense that.
Yeah.
And most of the time you don't actually.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, you'll hear something that you know is
Yeah.
special. So, you know, when I heard that pairing, and I saw the attention given by the labels, by the label and the management, you know, you could just see the way it was going.
Yeah.
I did not imagine it would be an album of the year, which
Yeah.
it ended up being. And
Yeah.
I ended up standing in front of 25,000 people at the Staples Center. There's
Uh-huh.
a little clip on our website,
Yes.
and watched by a billion people around the planet.
Wow.
And you know, you're just standing there going like, how did I get here? But I knew it was special, and yeah, there's many things that are special about it. You know, T-Bone is a special guy, but Mike Piersante is such a special engineer. There's something, you know, and what he does comes so easily to him that he just thinks it's this thing, this normal thing anybody can do. I don't think he even realizes how special it is. I think he has a sense, but
Yeah.
there's something magical about what he does. He knows how to blend elements together, and he managed to get those two singing together in a way that, or capture those two singing together in a way that was just this marvelous thing. I felt it when we did it. Ruben was there for it. We did it together. I think it was one of the early days when Ruben and I did a project together. You know, you know, he was assisting me for some years before that, but then he went out on his own, and I'm on my own. And then there's certain clients that request us both at once, and I think that was one of the first projects where that had happened. I don't know if I can think of anything else,
Well,
but you know,
working on those projects, working with Mike, it's kind of like a family now. We've done so many at this point, and that one was done off analog tape. One memory is that there was such a smell in the room, not only from the analog tape, but Mike always likes to bring this incense, this very particular incense. So whenever I listen to that record, immediately I'm transported back to that smell.
Yeah.
And it was a very special day. We knew there was something magical going on.
Yeah.
If anybody that knows that record knows it's like stepping into a soup.
Yeah.
You know, it's got a stew, you know, and it's talk about dynamic range and talk about being immersed, you know, it really does fill up the space, fill up the room. And as soon as we put up on those tapes on the board, it just came to life, and we just, you know,
you could feel that
unfolded.
one. That one was what it was. We also won a Tech Award in San Francisco, and we all went up there for it. And Robert said my name on stage, and all my colleagues and friends were in the audience. So I was standing back there going, yeah, Robert just said my name.
Was that the moment for you?
The guy from Led Zeppelin just said, yeah.
Yes. So good.
I was done at that point.
Yeah.
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 But turns out I wasn't done. I'm still here.
Well,
doing
and
it.
in a way, it's like you were a part of the process of getting Robert a Grammy. Like, that's huge, you know?
A
Like,
link in the
that's-
chain, yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, yeah, I mean, we would have so much more we could talk about, but, you know, we don't want to keep you guys here all day. So thank you so much
Thank you.
for this.
Thanks for having
Thanks for
us.
It was
coming
a
down.
blast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks for having
All
us.
right.
Appreciate it.
Check out Lurston Mastering, you guys. And
They're the best.
Yeah, I think that's it. All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.